Okay, it's the podcast. Welcome to the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey. So, hold on to your hats. I was recently rereading Chaucer's Prioress's Tale, just thinking about whether to do an episode on Little William of Norwich, when it occurred to me. And I thought, wait a minute, I haven't even done an episode on William Shakespeare yet. So maybe we'll hold off on the Chaucer for now. But I want this episode to be a little more than you might get on your average 10-minute summary of King Lear that you can find on YouTube. So we'll try to get down into the weeds a little bit. But let me say, for real, at the outset, you have to read Shakespeare. I mean, more than any other video I've done, this one isn't going to be an adequate substitute for doing the reading yourself. So I was just going over the plays that I've read by Shakespeare. Not all of them. I'm not a Shakespeare expert. My wheelhouse was actually 19th century American literature, and I like Shakespeare mainly because I remember reading that Melville read all of the Shakespeare plays in the year he was composing Moby Dick, or the year leading up to composing Moby Dick. So I've read Richard II, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, Romeo and Juliet, Titus Andronicus, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, and The Tempest. I think that's it. And of course, I wish I had read all of Shakespeare's plays, but the truth is, for me at least, Shakespeare has always been difficult. In fact, I remember in like 9th grade we were assigned Twelfth Night, and it just swamped me. Like, I thought I was a pretty smart kid. I couldn't do it. And I remember saying to my mom at the time, like, I can't read this stuff. It's not English, you know. And it is kind of maddening to feel like, why can't I read this? You know, it's a real stretch. Like, if you've grown up after being born in 1978, or if you were born like later than that, and you didn't read the King James Bible as a kid, like, King Lear is going to be tough. It's tough reading. There's a lot of difficult language in it. And so I think, like, I guess the point for me is I have gone really slowly through these Shakespeare plays that I've read because I want to really get it. And to do that, I've often had to read these plays 2, 3, 4 times, and again, slowly. I definitely know that I like the tragedies the best, and I hope to do an episode on Hamlet in the future. But yeah, like, there really are experts on Shakespeare, and this, although most of them, of course, are possessed by the brain worm of, like, woke politics right now, but you know, they know their stuff, and that's not what I am, and that's not what this video is, okay? What this is like, we're just a bunch of regular dudes trying to see if we can read Shakespeare. So, you know, like, welcome, fellow groundlings, right? Okay. It takes me about 4 hours usually to read a Shakespeare play. But, like, what an investment, honestly. The experience of the language alone, even aside from any plot or character development, really makes it worthwhile. Reading Shakespeare always reminds me that, like, most of us speak in a kind of brute shorthand to one another, and if we have fluency in English, we find few opportunities for using the entire range of our language. And it's not the doths and these and alacks that make Shakespeare's language so distinctive. In fact, you hardly notice that stuff after an hour of reading. Instead, it's the way that he puts things. It's like both the semi-regular pentameter rhythms of the lines, as well as the extraordinary range of syntactical arrangement. There are puns, of course, and these are fun, although sometimes ham-fisted. But there are also the very subtle allusions and callbacks, the suggestive analogies, the double entendres, and somehow all of that is packed into what reads almost always as believable and realistic dialogue. Not that people really spoke in, you know, intricate pentameter and with perfectly florid lyricism, but the things they are saying underneath the decorative language is, finally, what they really would be saying. It's the gist of it, you know? These people on stage, they're people. They're not archetypes that you're looking at in Shakespeare. And that's an important thing to consider here, by the way. I read a book one time about the drama tradition in England before the time of Shakespeare, or like leading up to the time of Shakespeare. It would have been like traveling troupes of actors, basically, mostly bachelors, putting on little moral set pieces for the locals in various towns, as they traveled across the country. I mean, so, well, these plays I put in quotes because they wouldn't really strike you as typical now, but that's because of Shakespeare's influence. But these plays would usually involve actors putting on literally a sandwich board and like writing on the front of it something like love, okay? And that would be one character. And another character would be jealousy. He would have that scrawled on his sandwich board. And another might be duplicitousness or, whatever. And then these characters would come out on the stage and sort of say their very moralizing lines, in a like a Christian didactic sort of way, okay? And you can read about morality plays on Wikipedia, by the way. That's what that book was called, Morality Play. I forget the author. It was a pretty good book, not like a novel. But you can, if you just Google morality play, there's a good Wikipedia page to explain what this is. And these plays were performed as the norm right up through the time of Shakespeare, which is, well, it makes Shakespeare all the more remarkable. And so when you understand that as the established like literary backdrop, then the realism of Shakespeare's characters seems like almost, I mean, it's astonishing. Like it seems as if some alien implanted this new vision in him at the time. Like from all we know, by the way, it seems that Shakespeare didn't even have access to Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, the Greek tragedians. Although he might have, I read yesterday, he might have had, like, he might have been able to read Latin and some later Latin drama, which was kind of derivative of the Greek tragedians. So where does he get this sort of mind, the mind of what I'm calling realism, just not in like a technical sense, but like in a way that would, that generally satisfies even modern moviegoers who, go see their favorite Kubrick film or something. You're not going to get much more there in terms of psychology and like human nature than you found in Shakespeare 500 years ago. So, or whatever, 400, 500 years ago. So, although he, like I said, although he might have read some of the later Latin drama, there were also a few contemporaries. So you had Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Kidd and Ben Jonson, who are interestingly not ever assigned. I've read one or two of their plays. I would say they're like semi-comparable to Shakespeare's plays. They're probably not as timeless feeling in a way, but I think they deserve mention anyway. And they may have pushed Shakespeare's work in this direction. But in general, I mean, I do think Shakespeare gets the kind of credit he deserves for having pretty much birthed English drama as like a full-grown thing, amazingly. And I guess what I mean here is that like the psychological depth and realism that you find in a play like Hamlet, again, hasn't really been outdone in the years since these were first performed. And if anyone has outstripped Shakespeare in this regard, they have done so by standing on his shoulders. And here I am thinking of Melville's Moby Dick, which was written like within a year after Melville read all of Shakespeare's plays. And the influence is obvious. Like when you read Ahab giving one of his speeches, it's a Lear speech. Or when you read Edgar going crazy out in the wilderness, like you see that Pip's speech when he loses his mind in chapter 93 and then 99 in Moby Dick, like certainly Melville was cognizant of Shakespeare's manner of doing crazy talk. Okay, so that's something worth considering. The other thing I wanted to mention there is that, like, isn't it interesting, like I said, that this genre seems to like emerge fully formed, and I think that's worth considering. Like, I'm not saying there've never been refinements on stage plays. Probably there have, and probably you could say, yeah, we've made some advances in that direction. But like, I think the play as a thing really kind of just pops into existence over the course of like 50 or 100 years there during Shakespeare's lifetime, and now here it is, right? And the same seems to be like I think YouTube videos might be another almost like fully emergent genre, and if it's still around in 400 years, which is unlikely, I imagine, but like with what I'm saying is with these new genres, these new forms, it's not going to take 400 years to like refine the shape of it. Instead, it happens. It kind of comes, a full package. Okay. Well, anyway. So for my first Shakespeare episode, I chose King Lear against the wishes of my viewers, by the way. Just another subtle neg in the fashion of the Godword podcast against the viewers who wanted Hamlet. But mostly because there's a really good movie version featuring Mel Gibson as Hamlet, and it's word for word, and you should watch all of it. And so, I think you'll get you'll be able to understand Hamlet on your own. But also because of all the plays I've read, Lear seems to me to be kind of the most unflinching in the way that it faces problems that many of us would recognize like as our problems, and it faces them all in this one perfect play. I mean, you've got things like nature's indifference and human betrayal and the lust for power and a banished truth teller and broken family dynamics, all this stuff. The whole drama is separated by the thinnest veil from an absolutely cold, stark, nihilistic worldview. And in fact, maybe there's no separation at all. I mean, that might be sort of, I think some people think that King Lear is just pure nihilism. So it certainly is brutal and heartbreaking, and it's delivered almost without a cathartic moment. Except, let me say, there is that language. The language, for me, makes it possible to endure the story. Like, it would be almost too sad. If you took this story out of rhyme and you just wrote it up as a novel, for example, if you took it out of, not necessarily rhyme, but the iambic rhythm of the whole thing, if you sort of just wrote it up as a novel, it would be like too cold. It would be crushing, But I think something about it being in Shakespeare's language, his full poetic mastery, like this is what makes it. What's the word? What's that word? You come to the mountaintop, sublime. You know what I mean? Like that's what the play feels like, even though it's crushing, but it's presented in sort of beautiful terms. Okay, well, whatever. I mean, a summary here is gonna be very vain of me. I mean, honestly, I just finished reading the play yesterday. I read it all day, and my impression is that Shakespeare really does seem like, the very next thing to scripture in what we call the Western canon. Borderline sacred, like truly muse-inspired. I read it slowly and closely, the same way I read the Bible, and I don't lose patience with the footnotes. In fact, I marvel at, that they are so necessary. In fact, it makes me wonder, how have we forgotten so many words and idioms? More to the point, how did they, back then, Elizabethan England, know so many? I've heard that Shakespeare used around 20,000 words, whereas most people get through life using only about 3,000 words. I mean, many of you probably know that feeling of knowing a word but never finding an opportunity to use it. I mean, it's frustrating, isn't it? I had a moment in my early 20s where I got into this while I was reading Shakespeare, and I think I tweeted something about this the other day. Actually, there was, when I was reading Turgenev, a good translation of Turgenev, Fathers and Sons, I started keeping lists of words that I wanted to use. And, whether it was who uses words like, sanguine or punctilious or lugubrious or whatever, those fun words to say. But you find that even if you know them and you start to use them around people, you just generally get blank stares. And so I guess maybe there's something about it being literary, being on stage, that allowed Shakespeare to feel like he had license to go for it in terms of these words. But somehow it seems people understood them maybe better back then. Anyway, whatever. The main plot line of the story is that you've got an aging King Lear. He's an octogenarian. He's looking to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters in the opening scene, probably for reasons that would be reasonable. He's getting older. He wants to, sort of put his ducks in a row before he loses his wits or something like that. And already this is pretty interesting. I mean, because the play starts, right? Well, what has been his life for 80 years before the opening of the play? We don't know. Like, that's an interesting place to start a story. His eldest, and by the way, his wife is not mentioned. She's sort of gone. Like, we don't know. Maybe she died years and years ago. Maybe he had more than one wife. Like, it's been a long time, right? So anyway, his eldest two daughters are married. His youngest daughter, Cordelia, who seems to be his favorite, is at the outset being courted by two men, two princes. I think it's France and Burgundy or something like that. And so at that moment, King Lear brings out the map to divide the kingdom. And the older sisters, they're no problem, first of all, because they're both married. So he's going to give them each a third of the kingdom, and their husbands will sort of, be co-owners of that with them. The two older sisters give these very eloquent speeches about their gratitude to their father and how good he's been to them and how much they love him, and they kind of flatter him and so on. When it comes her turn, Cordelia, the third born, the youngest, who seems to have been his favorite, sort of freezes, actually. Lear commands her, speak. And she only says, literally, nothing. That's what she says. And he blinks. This is one of those perfect moments you can kind of feel because of the way that the first two girls did their speeches. When she says nothing, it's like the air electrifies all of a sudden. And so he says, nothing will come of nothing. Speak again. Like, you can kind of feel him go like, what, daughter? And so what he wants, of course, is another round of flattery. But she is not a sophist. She is not a flatterer. She is not a, empty talker or a liar or a mountebank or a charlatan. Okay? So she says again, quote, unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less. Now, there is one more back and forth to try to draw from her these sweet words he wants to hear. But again, her inability to give him what he wants to hear comes off a second time. And then finally, that's where the play is off and running. He is so pissed at her that he cuts her out of the will immediately. He marries her off to some French prince who, takes her, even though she has no dowry. And basically, he hopes to never see her again. Now, this is like a crazy moment in the play because it's like the very first scene. It's the opening of the play. And even then, you're kind of like, what's this old guy's problem? It doesn't make any sense. So there is this question, like, why does he do it? But this is what I love about Shakespeare. Hell, man, why does anybody do anything? This is how people operate. Maybe he slept poorly the night before. Maybe he missed his dead wife and saw some of her in Cordelia and it triggered him somehow. Or maybe he was still a little bit vain at age 80 and wanted to hear the flattering words. That wouldn't be shocking for a king. This is all human nature, and now it's in another mess. Okay? And I love this stuff. I love literature when it forces us to realize that people are not perfectible. They just are not. And so all your plans for perfection and your utopianism fall flat when you have a realistic grasp on what human nature is. And that's part of what King Lear insists upon all the way through it. Now, a number of side plots begin to develop. This is going to be hard, right? This is why I said this is futile to try to do all of King Lear in a 45-minute video. But I'll just briefly put a pin in them. The first is there's the older of the two daughters. Lear had intended to not the older of the two. The older two daughters, Lear had intended to kind of phase into leadership, right? He gives them the land. And by the way, he divides up the third portion of land among them now too, because the third one, Cordelia, is disinherited. And so the plan is he's going to give them the land to kind of manage and get comfortable or whatever, while he, Lear, retains the title, king, and the power. But what happens is, very quickly, they start wielding power themselves and basically subverting and undermining him. They first demand that he cut his retinue of like loyal men, the knights and so on, down from I think 100 initially to 50 or 25, and then finally to none. So, insulted, King Lear finds himself, he says, fine, screw you, I will not even stay with you in your homes if I have to get rid of my men. It's, again, understandable, right? He's pissed, not his greatest moment, but he wanders out into the wilderness on what turns out to be a very stormy, rainy night, with only his fool and a gentleman to accompany him. Now, there's another plot line, which is Lear's loyal servant, the Earl of Kent, tried to tell the king that it was bad form to cut Cordelia out of the will. He tried to intervene, as it was happening in that first scene. Lear was enraged and sent Kent out into exile. He says, basically, get out of my kingdom. But Kent, so loyal, actually disguises himself, reappears the next day, and tries, basically befriends King Lear as a guy named Caius. It's a really interesting device for the literature here. I mean, basically it allows Kent, who has been a longtime servant of the king, to remain present for all of Lear's most painful falls, even as he's sort of helpless to do anything about it because he doesn't have any power now that he's not Kent. He's Caius. But he does finally reveal himself at the end of the play, but I gotta say, it sort of falls flat. I think it was a little too late then for it to be meaningful consolation. It seems the king doesn't even really recognize him at the final at the revelation or recognition scene at the end. Okay, here's another plot line. While all that's happening, the Earl of Gloucester's two sons, Edmund, the bastard, and Edgar, the legitimate heir, you can think Jacob and Esau here, become entangled in a contest to win favor from their father. Or rather, I should say, Edmund goes full Jacob to his brothers Esau and tries to worm his way into the inheritance. He writes fake letters in his brother's name and gets Edgar in trouble, such that Edgar has to run away and goes off wandering in the wilderness in rags, dressed and speaking like a madman, basically in order to evade arrest, because there's this order arrest Edgar as a traitor or something, and so he has to go in a disguise. So then Edmund gives this great speech at this one point where he sets up one of the themes of the play. Now, Edmund, the bastard child, he turns full Machiavellian here. I mean, and it's not the good kind of Machiavellian. A lot of you guys have been into Machiavelli over the last couple of years. I mean, if you read Lear and you pay attention to Edmund, you'll see the problem with Machiavellianism at the end of the play, basically. So Edmund, anyway, he gives this great speech. I'm going to read it to you. It says this, quote, "Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me? For that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother. Why, bastard, wherefore base? When my dimensions are as well compact, my mind as generous, and my shape as true as honest madam's issue, why brand they us with base, with baseness, bastardy, base, base? Who, in the lusty stealth of nature, take more composition and fierce quality than doth within a dull, stale, tired bed, go to the creating a whole tribe of fops, got 'tween asleep and wake. Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. Our father's love is to the bastard Edmund as to the legitimate. Fine word, legitimate. Well, my legitimate. If this letter speed, and my invention thrive, Edmund the base shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper. Now gods, stand up for bastards." So this is the rally speech for anybody who feels like they've been, shortchanged in the birth order or whatever, I guess. The thing about this is that it establishes this theme of nature and what is natural. For example, the right to inheritance, the firstborn son, is that a natural thing? Is that part of natural law? do nature and reason stand opposed in some cases? And I think it's hard to say that Shakespeare is taking sides here. I think he's just showing us how these principles dance together. Some people venerate Machiavelli and his cunning. Others venerate the British Romantic poets and their feeling principle. And it's a tug of war. I mean, there's reason in madness and a madness in reason, and both ends are explored here. Anyway, the legitimate son, Edgar, and Lear meet up in my favorite scene out there on the heath, in the night, in the howling rain and the thunderstorm. Both of them are exiles, right? Both of them should have been like in authority, and now both of them are ousted. At one point you have Lear himself losing his mind, Edgar pretending to be crazy, and the fool, whose job it is, of course, to act mad professionally, all holed up together in this little like cave thing out there in the heather. It's really an amazing scene just for the setting and the theme of madness and the wild dialogue that you have to really read closely to appreciate. At one point, Lear begins to pray. For the first time that we see him pray there. And then at that point, like in the middle of this storm, he seems to start to sympathize with all the lost souls in the world, with all the alienated. And you can sort of feel him start to grow and to gain a new perspective, maybe a new humility or whatever. He becomes more fully human here. At one point, he strips off his clothes, which of course levels him, right? Like the king always wears fancy purple and gold and stuff. Not here. Out in the wilderness, he is leveled with everybody else. And here he starts to feel a kinship with Edgar, who is acting as Tom O'Bedlam, this crazy man escaped from a lunatic asylum, who's naked or near naked. In fact, Lear starts to refer to him, to Edgar, as a philosopher. He's a Diogenes figure at this point. It is out there in the wilderness, banished in his own kingdom on the stormiest night of the year, that King Lear begins to level up and to really become human in the most, sort of pathetic way. Now, Cordelia at the time is in France, but now the king feels bad about it because of this storm in his mind. But of course, also now, because he's out there in the fields, he can't do anything about it. So there's a glorious stage direction that keeps recurring every now and then through this storm scene that just says, "Storm still." And I love it because, of course, you have to breathe life into these plays with your imagination more than you might in a novel. I mean, obviously, what's happening here is the storm is a reflection of Lear's inner turmoil. So one of the characters describes it, says, "One minded like the weather, most unquietly." That's how he describes Lear. And he even shows, Lear even shows an awareness of his own cracking wits. He's up against the storm, well, at least in the beginning of it, but he shows this resolve to like battle with it. So he breaks out, I think it's the beginning of Act 3 or somewhere around there. He says, "Blow, winds, and crack your cheeks, rage, blow, you cataracts and hurricanos, spout till you have drenched our steeples, drowned our cocks." Okay, so or drowned the cocks. Now he's, at this point, an old man with white hair leaning into the wind. His hair is blowing everywhere, like a true madman. You gotta love it. It's in the middle of all this storming that the fool steps up and offers a really awesome prophecy that I want to mention here, I guess, because it feels kind of timeless but also trenchant in 2021. Quote, "When priests are more in word than matter, when brewers mar their malt with water, when nobles are their tailors' tutors, no heretics burn but wenches' suitors, then shall the realm of Albion come to great confusion." So, I mean, yeah, when, the priests talk all day and never do anything about it, when the brewers dilute their brew with water, when nobles are their tailors' tutors, that means when they give advice to the tailors about fashion. How about this line? "When no heretics burn but wenches' suitors," that means none of the heretics get in trouble except the ones who get venereal diseases from the prostitutes, right? "Then shall England, the realm of Albion, come to great confusion." So this is the topsy-turvy, the great turmoil at the end of an age. Another favorite part of this is the very long scene in The Wild Storm, like I said, where Lear asks Edgar, and who, remember, at this moment is disguised as a crazy man, Tom O'Bedlam, a literal crazy man. He says, "What hast thou been?" And I just want to read Edgar's reply. Quote, "A serving man, proud in heart and mind, that curled my hair. War's gloves in my cap. Served the lust of my mistress's heart, and did the act of darkness with her. Swore as many oaths as I spake words, and broke them in the sweet face of heaven. One that slept in the contriving of lust, and waked to do it. Wine loved I deeply, dice dearly, and in woman out paramored the Turk. False of heart, light of ear, bloody of hand, hog in sloth, fox in stealth, wolf in greediness, dog in madness, lion in prey. Let not the creaking of the shoes nor the rustling of the silks betray the poor heart to woman. Keep thy foot out of brothels, thy hand out of plackets, thy pen from lenders' books, and defy the foul fiend. Still through the hawthorn blows the cold wind, says Sum mun nani, dolphin, my boy, Sessa, let him trot by." Okay, awesome. This is a crazy man speaking, and he's trying to admit every sin on the books, It's an awesome scene. And he's doing it so that he can, again, stay hidden because he doesn't want to be arrested for treason. But also at this point, he's starting to sympathize with the crazy going Lear. Anyway, the conclusion of this play is very much discussed. I don't want to, it won't mean very much to you if you haven't read it already. But basically, the older sisters prove to be total snakes and sort of wind up killing each other. There are a few loyal people, but they aren't able to prevent the tragic outcome. And when, finally, under warlike conditions, Cordelia returns from France to her father's kingdom, basically in charge of the troops, she finds him totally broken. They have a little moment of reunion, sort of partial recognition, but then they have to separate. And eventually, because Edmund has orders that she be hanged if found, it becomes a terrible mess. Edgar returns to charge his brother Edmund with subversion or treason or whatever. They do a sword fight to the death. Edmund, the bastard Machiavellian, as he lies there dying, denies nothing, and in fact tries to stop the kill order on Cordelia. He seems to have a change of heart there right at the last minute maybe, but of course it's all too late. Well, before I tell you about the very final scene with Lear and Cordelia, there was also the famous scene where Cornwall, one of the older sister's husbands, gouges out the eyes of the Earl of Gloucester, who has sort of threatened to stand between him and the power he seeks. There's that famous line, "Out, vile jelly!" And the violence happens on stage here, which is rather rare. Again, this gets me thinking about stage directions, which are so sparse, and the many adaptations and interpretations that so many directors have generated over the years. It's part of the reason these plays are kind of they're mentally exhausting to read, much easier to watch. But then when you watch them, it's are you really getting it the right way? There would be so many different ways to stage the eye-plucking scene, for example. In Act 5, Scene 3, Lear and Cordelia are brought in by Edmund as prisoners. Cordelia leans over to him and says, quote, "We are not the first who, with best meaning, have incurred the worst." And Lear's reply is great. He says, "No, no, no, no. Come, let's away to prison. We two alone will sing like birds i' the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. So we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and hear poor rogues talk of court news. And we'll talk with them too, who loses and who wins, who's in, who's out, and take upon us the mystery of things, as if we were God's spies, and we'll wear out in a walled prison packs and sects of great ones that ebb and flow by the moon." It's a beautiful, poignant, touching scene, and speech, but of course, it's not meant to be. Instead, a page later, after Edmund loses his sword fight with Edgar, Lear comes back, enters the stage, now an 80-year-old man, totally broken, and now literally carrying Cordelia in his arms, dead. As Kent says, all's cheerless, dark, and deadly. It's really a hard grind to get through the end of this play because everything bad that can happen, happens. Like I said, if there is a glimmer of hope in this play, it is the loyalty of Kent and of Albany. But Albany couldn't stop anything from happening for lack of courage, and Kent revealed himself too late. It's not, or he was hapless and the king wouldn't listen to him. It's not even totally clear, by the way, that King Lear recognizes Kent when the revelation finally comes, which is quite painful because Kent really demonstrated true loyalty to him. The king then collapses and dies. Edgar gets the last 4 lines of the play. He says, these are great lines, quote, "The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. The oldest hath borne most. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long." Well, to me, again, these are relevant lines. That idea, it seems to me that the many problems of the play arise from false words, from flattering words, from people saying things that they think they have to say to satisfy the social moment rather than the truth, or, and it's the same thing, basically, not saying the truth when they should say it. And I think, obviously that feels relevant to me in 2021, but yeah, that's part of the main theme of King Lear here. Final reflection, there's a lot to say about this play. You've got the problems of human nature, right? Theological problems. Is there justice on earth? What is the origin of evil? Why are men inclined to it? It seems so stubborn. Can they be reformed? All of these questions seem sort of forced by the play and then not resolved. Similarly, with, let me take a sip here. With, the end of the play, the catharsis that we want, that you would get in, usually in Aeschylus or Sophocles and usually in Euripides, that scene of recognition that Aristotle talks about in the Poetics, in Lear, it all comes too late. So for example, the scene in the Odyssey, you're going to get it. You get the scene of reunion between Odysseus and Penelope, or between Odysseus and his dad, or Odysseus and his son. It comes back together. It's been long, it's been difficult, it's been a struggle, but catharsis comes at the end. In Lear, it never comes back together. There's a constant effort in that direction, but it isn't meant to be, what does that mean? I don't know. It's sad. Shakespeare seemed to love ambiguity. I think with this play in particular, at least, he left us basically ice cold. There's no consolation or nothing for sure at the end of the play. I think, again, I would recommend reading Bakhtin on dialogism and polyphony, which is that idea of just many voices coexisting. So in the Brothers Karamazov, he writes about, you've got Ivan and Dmitri and Alyosha and Smerdyakov, and they all have sort of different views of the world, and the father, and the whatever her name is, I can't remember the prostitute lady's name or whatever, and so all Dostoevsky does is just set them into motion, and he's not going to resolve anything for you, and I think Shakespeare does the same thing. The reason we love it is precisely because it's not propaganda. This play is not telling you not to be a racist or to be nice to people who have, gender misidentity syndrome or whatever. None of that. You're not getting told to do anything. It's just a study of real people in a mess. And that's why we read it, and that's why we like it. If I were, by the way, looking, as I sometimes do, for a more archetypal reading of this, to get beyond just a literary realism, which I think you could do. I mean, some people do read Lear as like an allegory for various things. I might do the thing where, like, you might start with the root word for Cordelia being heart, and and the beginning of the play then being, the king betraying the heart, and there's that tug of war again between, like, nature and reason and feeling, and there might be something going on here. The betrayal of the heart at the start of the play, and then the rest of the play, this attempt to gain a reunion with the heart, the broken heart, as it were. And then, but in this play, when the king finally gets back in touch with the heart with Cordelia, she is almost totally gone or withered or broken. In this case, hanged, dead. So, and this seems to follow a sort of like out of Eden kind of a narrative. You're expelled. Like, that's it. There isn't a second chance. Like, once you're out of Eden, the Garden of Eden is, guarded by those twin cherubims with flaming swords turning in every direction, and so you can't find it, and if you did find it, you can't get back in there. That seems to be part of the, like, psychological schema that moves this play. Okay, so like I said, I mean, if you compare it to the Homeric narrative, where you've got this wizened old man, Odysseus, trying to get home, I mean, he does get home. Homer gives us the arrival at home after 20 hard years at least. We don't get that in King Lear, period. And it's heartbreaking. And that's part of what makes it kind of a difficult read, but it's also, like, profoundly memorable. I think maybe this is part of the reason that Shakespeare's characters stick with me, probably more than characters in anything else, because he lets the characters be so real that even the plot doesn't get like subsumed under them. It's like the characters triumph all the way to the end, even if that means they're going to stab each other to death and betray each other and basically end in a mess. It also hints that may be the fate of people in the world who interact with other people, unless they can figure out ways to compromise and basically, like, change their character, give up their character. I mean, I've heard some people read, like, a kind of Christian martyrdom, ego death kind of thing is suggested by King Lear, where you may have to give up yourself in order to not cause destruction in your network of people, something like that, which is sad, right? Because we also think of integrity and authenticity as being important. But I think part of what, like, Lear and Edgar's a really interesting character, because Edgar goes out there and basically becomes another person, so that when he gets back at the end of the play and people are asking him who he is, he's like, it doesn't matter who I am. My name is dead. My person is dead. All that matters is this letter I bring showing that my brother was a traitor or something like that. And so maybe there's almost like a postmodern take on identity happening there, where you might have to become post self and just give it up in order to not cause destruction all around you, something like that. Well, man, look at that. We're done with the King Lear episode, and it went really fast. Listen, we do have the Friday Secret Stream this week for patrons only. I hope you'll consider joining if you haven't. The conversations have been really good and interesting, and also, like, I am kind of working hard on these. I try pretty hard at them. Throw me $5 a month, and I appreciate you. What else? Yep. That's all. Oh, follow me on Odyssey. Why aren't you following me on Odyssey? In fact, you should even watch these videos on Odyssey. I think I care more about views over there now than I do on YouTube. It seems to be a much better vehicle. You should have an account there. I think you even get, like, tokens that can be changed for money as you watch videos. It seems like it could be a pretty good deal. Okay, anyway, I'll talk to you guys more next time. See ya. And see you patrons Friday. Get psyched. If you have ideas for conversation, we could talk. I mean, just DM me on Twitter at Godward16. Bye-bye.